October 15th, 2023. A routine Dallas to Boston flight turned into a nightmare when Captain Richard Hayes collapsed at 35,000 feet, leaving 147 passengers screaming in terror as the plane began to tilt. But then, from the economy section, a 16-year-old kid, the son of the flight attendant everyone ignored, calmly walked into the cockpit and grabbed the controls. Could a teenager with no pilot's license really land a commercial airliner, or were they all about to plummet from the sky? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of October 15th, 2023, started like any other Tuesday at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Captain Richard Hayes adjusted his tie in the crew lounge mirror, his silver hair perfectly combed, his uniform pressed to perfection. At 52 years old, with over 20,000 flight hours under his belt, he'd flown this Dallas to Boston route so many times he could practically do it with his eyes closed. Today would be Flight AA2847, scheduled departure at 9:45 a.m. What Richard didn't know was that the mild headache he'd been ignoring for the past hour wasn't from his morning coffee. It was the first warning sign of something far more sinister brewing inside his body. In the economy cabin, 16-year-old Marcus Chen pressed his face against the cold terminal window, watching the ground crew load luggage into the belly of the Boeing 737. His backpack sat between his feet, stuffed with textbooks he'd been pretending to study during his mom's overnight shift. Elena Chen, his mother, was already on board, smoothing down her flight attendant uniform and checking her appearance in the galley mirror for the third time. She caught her reflection and sighed. 12 years she'd been doing this job, serving drinks, collecting trash, forcing smiles at passengers who rarely saw her as anything more than part of the airplane's furniture. Her fellow crew members weren't much better. Sarah Whitmore and Jennifer Banks chatted near the forward galley, their conversation stopping abruptly whenever Elena walked by. The message was clear. She wasn't part of their club. "Your kid's flying with us again?" Sarah had asked earlier, her tone dripping with barely concealed judgment. "Must be nice getting those buddy passes." Eleanor had simply nodded, biting back the response she really wanted to give. Marcus flew standby whenever he could. Not because it was nice, but because it was free, and because a single mother working as a flight attendant couldn't afford regular babysitters for a teenager who'd gotten himself suspended from Lincoln High School for 3 days. Again, so the suspension wasn't for anything terrible. Marcus had hacked into the school's computer system to change the cafeteria menu as a prank, replacing Mystery Meat Monday with detailed nutritional breakdowns and supplier information that revealed the school board's questionable food contracts. Noble, maybe, smart, definitely not when you got caught, so here they were. Marcus would sit quietly in 32B, and Elena would work the flight. And maybe, just maybe, they'd both get through the day without any more trouble. As passengers began boarding, Eleanor fell into her practiced routine. Welcome aboard. Seats on your right. Welcome aboard. Overhead bins above you. Smile, nod, repeat. The faces blurred together, business travelers in wrinkled suits, families wrangling restless children, an elderly couple moving slowly down the aisle with matching floral print carry-ons. Then came the first-class passengers, the ones who boarded early and expected special treatment. Gregory Ashford III settled into 2A like he owned the plane, his tailored suit probably worth more than Elena made in 3 months. He was already on his phone, barking orders at someone about quarterly projections. Behind him, Vanessa Kirkland, a local news anchor whose face Marcus recognized from the billboards near their apartment, arranged her designer luggage with the careful precision of someone used to being photographed. In seat 14C, Dr. Patricia Moss adjusted her reading glasses and opened a medical journal. At 67, she'd been a cardiac surgeon for over 40 years and was heading to Boston for a conference on innovative heart procedures. She delivered the keynote speech at dozens of these events, but lately, the travel exhausted her more than she cared to admit. Marcus finally boarded in the last group, keeping his hood up and his head down. He'd perfected the art of being invisible, a useful skill when you were the scholarship kid at a school full of trust fund babies, and even more useful when your mom's co-workers whispered about you like you couldn't hear them. He slid into 32B and immediately pulled out his laptop. The school might have banned him from their network, but they couldn't stop him from working on his own projects. For the past 6 months, Marcus had been teaching himself to code flight simulation software. Not the video game kind, the real stuff, the programs that actual pilots use to train. He'd gotten surprisingly good at it, spending countless hours in his tiny bedroom, headphones on, flying virtual planes through digital skies while his mother worked overnight shifts. It was escapism, sure, but it was also fascinating. The physics of flight, the way tiny adjustments to pitch and yaw could mean the difference between a smooth landing and a disaster. It all made sense to him in a way that most things in his life didn't. Cabin crew, please prepare for departure. Captain Hayes's voice crackled through the intercom, smooth and reassuring. He'd made this announcement thousands of times. His co-pilot, First Officer Jake Morrison, was young, only 28, but competent enough. They'd flown together twice before, and Richard appreciated that Jake didn't try to fill every silence with small talk. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Elena ran through her safety demonstration with practiced efficiency. Most passengers ignored her, already absorbed in their phones and tablets. Marcus watched, though, like he always did, mouthing along with the words he'd memorized years ago. In the unlikely event of a water landing, your seat cushion can be used as a flotation device. The engines roared to life, and flight AA2847 began its taxi toward the runway. Outside, the Texas sun beat down on the tarmac, heat shimmers rising in waves. Inside the cockpit, Richard rolled his shoulders, trying to ease the tension that had been building in his neck. The headache was getting worse, but he'd flown through worse. Probably just needed more water. He'd grab a bottle once they reached cruising altitude. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and Richard pushed the throttles forward. The Boeing 737 accelerated down runway 18R, the familiar rumble and vibration running through the entire aircraft. At 165 miles per hour, he pulled back on the yoke, and the nose lifted. The ground fell away beneath them, Dallas shrinking to a patchwork of streets and buildings. "Positive rate," Jake called out. "Gear up," Richard responded, his voice steady despite the pounding in his head that was now impossible to ignore. They climbed through the scattered clouds, the plane banking gently as they turned northeast toward Boston. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began the familiar rituals of air travel, reclining seats, pulling out laptops, requesting drinks. Elena moved through the cabin with her cart, pouring sodas and coffee, handing out tiny bags of pretzels. When she reached Marcus, she paused just long enough to give him a quick smile, the only genuine one she'd offered since boarding. "Doing okay?" she asked quietly. Marcus nodded without looking up from his laptop screen, where lines of code scrolled past. "Yeah, Mom, all good." She wanted to say more, wanted to ask if he'd thought about the suspension, about what came next, about whether he understood that these pranks had consequences. But not here, not now. So she just squeezed his shoulder and moved on. In the cockpit, 37 minutes into the flight, Captain Richard Hayes reached for his water bottle with a hand that had started to tremble. The headache had evolved into something else entirely, a crushing pressure behind his eyes, a numbness creeping down his left arm. His vision blurred at the edges. "Jake," he started to say, but the word came out slurred, wrong. First Officer Morrison turned, his expression shifting from curiosity to alarm in half a second. "Captain Hayes?" Richard tried to respond, tried to tell his co-pilot that something was very wrong, but his mouth wouldn't cooperate. The cockpit tilted sickeningly, or maybe that was him, slumping forward against his harness as consciousness slipped away like water through his fingers. The autopilot kept the plane flying straight and level at 35,000 feet, completely unaware that the man who'd programmed it had just lost consciousness, and in that moment, everything changed. Jake Morrison's training kicked in before his brain fully processed what was happening. His hands moved to shake Richard's shoulder, calling his name with increasing urgency. "Captain Hayes, Richard, can you hear me?" Nothing. The captain's head lolled against the side window, his breathing shallow and irregular. Jake's pulse hammered in his ears as he reached across to check for a carotid pulse. They're weak but present. "Still alive. But for how long?" His fingers found the intercom button. "This is First Officer Morrison. I need a flight attendant in the cockpit immediately. Medical emergency." In the forward galley, Sarah Whitmore's face went white. Medical emergency. Those two words were every crew member's nightmare. She grabbed the intercom handset, her voice tight. "Roger that." "Coming now." Jennifer Banks was already moving, unlocking the cockpit door with trembling hands. The sight that greeted them stopped both women cold. Captain Hayes slumped unconscious, the first officer frantically trying to stabilize their commanding pilot while simultaneously monitoring the instruments. "Is anyone on this plane a doctor?" Sarah's voice cracked over the PA system, professional composure fracturing. "We have a medical emergency and need immediate assistance in the forward cabin." The words hit the passenger cabin like a thunderclap. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. The atmosphere shifted from bored routine to electric anxiety in seconds. Dr. Patricia Moss was already unbuckling her seatbelt, moving up the aisle with the determined stride of someone who'd spent decades responding to emergencies. Elena materialized beside her, and together they squeezed into the cockpit's cramped space. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'm a cardiac surgeon," Patricia announced, already assessing the captain with practiced eyes. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, timing his pulse against her watch. "Radial pulse is thready." Breathing labored. "Someone get me the medical kit and AED now." Elena disappeared and returned within seconds, the red emergency bag clutched in her hands. Patricia worked with swift efficiency, checking Richard's pupils with a penlight, monitoring his vitals. Her expression growing grimmer by the second. "This looks like a stroke," she said quietly. Her words meant only for Jake. "Major cerebral event. He needs advanced medical care immediately. CT scan, possibly emergency surgery. We need to land this plane soon." Jake's throat went dry. He was certified to fly the 737, of course. He had 800 hours in type and had landed in various conditions, but never as pilot in command on a commercial flight full of passengers. Never with this much pressure. Never with the weight of 147 lives resting solely on his shoulders. "Okay," he said, forcing his voice steady. "Okay, I can do this. I'll get us down." He reached for the radio, contacting air traffic control. "Cleveland Center, American 2847. We have an emergency. Captain is incapacitated, possible stroke. First officer assuming command. Requesting immediate diversion to nearest suitable airport and priority handling." The controller's voice came back instantly. "All business." "American 2847, Cleveland Center copies your emergency. Stand by for diversion options." "Emergency services will be standing by. What is your souls on board and fuel?" 147 souls on board, fuel for 3 more hours," Jake responded, already scanning his charts. They were over Pennsylvania, still nearly 2 hours from Boston. Pittsburgh was closest, maybe 40 minutes if he pushed it. "American 2847, recommend diversion to Pittsburgh International. Runway 28C will be available. Emergency equipment is being scrambled. Descend and maintain flight level 200. Descending to flight level 200. "American 2847. Jake's hands moved across the controls, disengaging the autopilot and beginning their descent. The plane's nose dipped slightly, the whine of the engines changing pitch. In the cabin, passengers felt the shift. The descent was steeper than normal, the angle just wrong enough to trigger instincts honed by hundreds of previous flights. Something wasn't right. Then came the announcement that would transform concern into full-blown terror. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Morrison speaking." Jake's voice was admirably controlled, but the words themselves were devastating. We are experiencing a medical emergency with our captain. I'm in command of the aircraft, and we will be making an emergency landing in Pittsburgh. Please remain calm, keep your seatbelts fastened, and follow all crew instructions." The cabin erupted. A woman in row 18 started screaming. A man near the back shouted for someone to do something. Children began crying, their parents' fear contagious. Gregory Ashford III was suddenly on his feet in first class, his phone out, trying to make a call despite Sarah's sharp orders to sit down. "This is unacceptable," he bellowed. "I have a board meeting in Boston at 3 o'clock. I demand to speak to whoever's in charge." "The person in charge is a 28-year-old co-pilot who's trying to save your life," Sarah snapped back, her patience evaporating. "Sit down now." Vanessa Kirkland had her phone out too, but instead of calling, she was recording, her news instincts overriding everything else. This was a story, possibly the biggest one she'd ever covered, and she was living it. Her hands shook as she held the camera steady, whispering into the microphone about the unfolding crisis. Elena moved through the chaos with forced calm, trying to reassure passengers even as her own heart raced. Her eyes kept drifting to seat 32B, where Marcus sat with his laptop still open, his face pale but focused. She wanted to go to him, to hold him, like she had when he was small, but her job demanded she tend to the dozens of other terrified people first. In the cockpit, Jake's hands were slick with sweat. The autopilot could handle straight and level flight, but landing, that required precision, timing, and a steady hand. He'd done it dozens of times in the simulator, hundreds of times as co-pilot, but always with a captain beside him, always with backup. He glanced at Richard Hayes, now lying flat in the cramped space behind the seats, Dr. Moss monitoring him while somehow staying out of the way. The captain's face was grey, his breathing ragged. Even if he survived, recovery would be long. There was no magical waking up, no sudden return to consciousness to save the day. This was real. This was happening. And Jake was alone. American 2847, Pittsburgh approach. Descend and maintain 10,000. Vectors for runway 28C will follow. Emergency equipment is in position. Descending to 10,000. American 2847. The plane dropped through the clouds, Pennsylvania's rolling hills appearing below. Pittsburgh's skyline came into view, the three rivers converging, the airport visible in the distance. Under any other circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Jake ran through his landing checklist, his voice mechanical as he called out each item: flaps, landing gear, speed, everything by the book. He couldn't afford a single mistake. But then, as they descended through 8,000 feet, something happened that Jake hadn't anticipated. Something that would make an already impossible situation exponentially worse. The plane shuddered, not the gentle buffeting of turbulence. This was different, a violent vibration that rattled the entire airframe. Warning lights blazed across the instrument panel. The number 2 engine, the right engine, was showing abnormal readings. Temperature spiking. "Pressure dropping." "No, no, no," Jake whispered, his eyes scanning the gauges in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not on top of everything else. The engine was failing, and as if the universe wanted to add one final twist to this nightmare, the fire warning bell began to ring, loud, insistent, impossible to ignore. They had an engine fire at 7,000 feet, minutes from landing, with an unconscious captain and a cabin full of terrified passengers. Jake Morrison was 28 years old, and he was about to face the most critical decision of his life. The fire warning bell pierced through the cockpit like a siren from hell. Jake's hands flew across the panel, executing the engine fire procedure he'd memorized, but never actually performed outside a simulator. Fuel cut off. Fire suppression. Shutdown sequence. Engine 2 fire, shutting down engine 2, he announced to air traffic control, his voice somehow remaining steady even as his mind screamed. American 2847 declaring emergency. Single engine attempting landing. Roger, American 2847, you're cleared for any runway. Crash equipment is standing by. Any runway. The words that every pilot dreads hearing because they mean one thing. You're in such bad shape that normal procedures no longer apply. Just get the plane on the ground. Any way you can." Jake pressed the fire suppression button, releasing halon gas into the engine compartment. The fire warning light continued to blaze red for 3 agonizing seconds, 4, 5, then finally, blessedly, went dark. The fire was out, but the engine was dead, and they were now flying on a single engine with a plane designed for 2. The aircraft immediately began pulling to the right, the asymmetric thrust trying to twist them off course. Jake's leg muscles burned as he pressed hard on the left rudder pedal, fighting to keep them aligned with the runway that was now visible through the windscreen. His arms ached from the constant corrections on the yoke. Dr. Moss looked up from Captain Hayes, her face grave. "How bad is it up here?" "We lost an engine," Jake said through gritted teeth. "But I can land this. I have to land this." In the cabin, the passengers had heard the boom of the engine compressor stalling, felt the violent shudder, and seen the flash of orange flame through the windows on the right side. The screaming intensified. A man in row 24 was praying loudly in Spanish. A woman was sobbing into her husband's shoulder. Children wailed. Marcus Chen felt his stomach drop, but not from fear, from recognition. He'd simulated this exact scenario 3 weeks ago. Engine failure on approach. The flight simulator software he'd been coding had included it as one of the emergency procedures. He'd crashed the first 5 attempts, figured it out by the 10th, and by the 20th could land it smoothly. But simulation and reality were different universes, weren't they? His eyes stayed glued to his laptop screen, where his custom software was still running. He'd connected it to a cheap ADS-B receiver he'd built from online tutorials, a device that picked up the transponder signal's aircraft broadcast. It meant he could see their plane's position, altitude, speed, and heading in real time on his screen. They were at 5,800 feet, descending at 900 feet per minute, speed 185 knots, heading 287 degrees. The runway was 12 miles ahead, bearing 282 degrees. Jake was lining them up, but the approach was too steep, the speed too high. Marcus had seen these numbers before. In his simulations, just before the crashes, his mother appeared at his row, her face a mask of controlled terror. "Marcus, honey, I need you to put that away, and—" "Mom!" His voice was quiet but urgent. "He's coming in too fast. Look at the angle. He's going to overshoot." Eleanor glanced out the window, then back at her son. "Marcus, the pilots know the pilot is dead or dying, and the co-pilot is 28 and has probably never landed a 737 single engine in his life." Marcus's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up performance charts he'd programmed into his software. At this weight and this speed with one engine, he needs to be at 160 knots, not 185, and his descent rate is too aggressive. "We're going to slam into the runway, or miss it completely." For just a moment, Elena saw not her suspended teenager, not the kid who'd embarrassed her with his school pranks, but someone else entirely. Someone focused, certain, terrifyingly calm. "How do you know all this?" she whispered. "Because I've been flying 737s for 6 months, just not real ones." In the cockpit, Jake was discovering exactly what Marcus had already calculated. He was too high, too fast, and the single engine wasn't giving him the control he needed. Every instinct screamed at him to add power, to stabilize, but he couldn't. Not without the right engine. He was trapped in a deadly physics problem with no good solution. American 2847, you're above glide slope. "Do you need to go around?" A go-round meant aborting the landing, climbing back up and trying again. But with one engine and a critically ill patient, circling for another attempt could mean the difference between Captain Hayes living or dying. It could also mean burning more fuel, creating more risk. Jake's hands trembled on the controls. He'd trained for this. He knew the procedures. But knowing and doing were catastrophically different when 147 people were counting on you to not screw up. The runway was 8 miles out, 7, 6. Behind him, Dr. Moss spoke urgently. "His blood pressure is dropping. He's going into shock. We need to be on the ground in the next 5 minutes or I'm going to lose him." 5 minutes. That was barely enough time to land under perfect conditions, let alone these. Jake made his decision. No go around. He'd get them down. He had to. He dropped the landing gear early, using the extra drag to help slow them down. The plane shuddered as the wheels deployed, the aerodynamics fighting against him. Speed dropped to 172 knots. Still too fast. 4 miles. 3. The runway stretched out ahead, a strip of grey concrete that looked impossibly narrow from this altitude. Emergency vehicles lined both sides. Red fire trucks, white ambulances, their lights flashing silently in the afternoon sun. Marcus watched his screen, watching their descent rate climb, 100 feet per minute. 200, that was entering controlled crash territory. His mind raced through the aerodynamics, the physics, the 1,000 variables he'd programmed into his simulations, and then he saw it. The solution. It was risky, insanely risky, but it would work. It had to work. He unbuckled his seatbelt. Marcus, no! Elena grabbed his arm, but he was already standing, already moving toward the front of the plane. I can help, he said simply. I know I can. Sarah Whitmore blocked the aisle, her professional training kicking in. Sit down immediately. We are on final approach. The co-pilot needs help, or we're all going to die. Marcus's voice cut through the cabin noise with startling clarity. Several nearby passengers heard him, their eyes widening. I've been training on 737 simulators for 6 months. I know this plane's systems. I know what he's doing wrong. You're a kid, Sarah said, but her conviction was wavering. Through the open cockpit door, she could see Jake's struggle, could see the white-knuckle grip on the controls, could see them approaching too fast. I'm a kid who's about to save your life, Marcus said. Let me through. 2 miles. The runway lights were clearly visible now. So were the trees at the approach end, the buildings beyond, the hard, unforgiving ground racing up to meet them. Elena made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, or save it. She released her son's arm. Go! Marcus squeezed past Sarah and burst through the cockpit door. Jake's head snapped around, his eyes wild. Who the hell? Get out of here, now! You're too fast and too steep, Marcus said, his voice somehow calm. You need to deploy full flaps now and add power to engine 1 to arrest the descent. The drag from full flaps will slow you down. The power will flatten your glide path. You have about 60 seconds before we hit. Jake stared at this teenager in a hoodie who was casually discussing flight dynamics during the worst moment of his life. Are you insane? Adding power will make us faster. Adding power will increase lift, which will flatten the approach, which gives the flaps more time to slow us down. Trust me, I've done this exact scenario 20 times. In what? A video game? In a professional-grade flight simulator using real-world physics and this exact aircraft model. Marcus pointed at the instruments. Look at your vertical speed indicator. You're descending at 100 to 300 feet per minute now. The landing gear can't handle more than 600 on touchdown. You're going to collapse the struts and cartwheel this plane. Jake's eyes flicked to the gauge. He was right. God help him, this kid was right. 1 mile. 45 seconds. Jake's hand hovered over the throttle, his entire body screaming that this was wrong, that you don't add power when you're already too fast, that this violated every instinct he had, but his instincts had been wrong about the approach angle, wrong about the speed, wrong about everything. He pushed the throttle forward on engine 1. The plane surged slightly, the nose coming up, the descent rate dropping to 1,000 feet per minute. He reached for the flap lever and moved it to the full down position, 40 degrees. The plane groaned as the massive wing surfaces deployed into the airstream, creating tremendous drag. The airspeed bled off rapidly, 168 knots. Thanks to 155, the descent rate stabilized at 700 feet per minute. Still high, but survivable. Reduce power now, Marcus said. Let the flaps finish the job. Jake pulled the throttle back. They were half a mile out, 30 seconds from touchdown. The runway threshold passed beneath them. The wheels were 15 feet up. 10, 5. The main gear touched down with a jarring thump, harder than any landing Jake had ever done, but the struts held. He immediately deployed the spoilers and thrust reverser on the single engine, feeling the plane pull violently to one side. His foot was through the floor on the rudder pedal, fighting to keep them straight. The nose gear slammed down. They were on the ground, decelerating hard, the entire plane shaking like it might tear apart. But they were down. They were alive. Jake brought them to a full stop halfway down the runway, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the controls. Emergency vehicles swarmed the aircraft within seconds. He turned to look at Marcus, this impossible kid who'd just saved 147 lives and managed a single word. How? The cabin erupted in chaotic relief. Some passengers sobbed, others cheered. A few sat in stunned silence, still gripping their armrests. The PA system crackled as Jake's voice, hoarse and shaking, addressed them. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are safely on the ground in Pittsburgh. Please remain seated while emergency personnel approach the aircraft." Through the cockpit windows, Marcus could see fire trucks forming a protective barrier around the plane, their crews ready with foam cannons in case any residual fire flared up. An ambulance raced directly toward the forward door, its lights painting the tarmac in alternating red and white. Dr. Moss was already preparing Captain Hayes for transport, her practiced hands securing IV lines and stabilizing his neck. "Paramedics need to be here 90 seconds ago," she muttered, checking his vitals one more time. His pulse was thready but present, breathing shallow but steady. He'd made it this far. Now it was up to the hospital. Jake sat frozen in the captain's seat, his hands still locked on the controls, as if letting go might cause the plane to somehow take off again. The adrenaline that had carried him through the landing was draining away, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. He became aware that he was shaking, not just his hands, but his entire body. "Hey!" Marcus's voice broke through the fog. "You did good. We're down safe." Jake turned to stare at him, really seeing him for the first time. A kid, maybe 16, 17 at most, wearing a faded hoodie and jeans, looking like he should be in math class somewhere, not in the cockpit of a commercial airliner saving lives. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper, before Marcus could answer. The cockpit door burst open, and 3 uniformed paramedics crowded in, immediately taking over from Dr. Moss. They worked with swift efficiency, transferring Captain Hayes onto a backboard, calling out vitals to each other, preparing to evacuate him. "Possible stroke. Approximately 40 minutes ago," Dr. Moss reported, falling into clinical mode. "Lost consciousness at altitude, no response to painful stimuli. Blood pressure's been dropping steadily. He needs a CT scan and likely emergency intervention." They had Hayes out of the cockpit in less than 2 minutes, navigating the narrow aisle, while passengers pressed themselves back to make room. Elena stood at row 32, her face pale, watching her son emerge from the cockpit behind the paramedics. The moment stretched between them, mother and son, separated by 12 rows and a lifetime of complicated history. Then Elena was moving, pushing past passengers, reaching Marcus and pulling him into a fierce embrace. "Don't you ever," her voice cracked, "don't you ever scare me like that again?" Marcus hugged her back, feeling her trembling against him. "I had to, Mom. He needed help." Sarah Whitmore appeared beside them, her earlier hostility completely evaporated. "What he did? I've never seen anything like it. That kid just saved everyone on this plane." But not everyone was ready to celebrate. Gregory Ashford III had pushed his way toward the front, his face purple with rage. "This is absolutely unacceptable. That child had no business in the cockpit. I want names, I want badge numbers, you want to be alive?" Dr. Moss's voice cut through his tirade like a scalpel. She'd stayed behind after the paramedics left, making sure no other passengers needed medical attention. Now she fixed Ashford with the kind of look that had made generations of surgical residents reconsider their career choices. "Because that child is the reason you're standing here complaining instead of being scattered across a Pennsylvania hillside. Show some gratitude or show some silence. Your choice." Ashford's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound came out. He retreated to his seat, deflated. Federal Aviation Administration officials were already boarding the aircraft. along with airline management, airport security, and what looked like half the Pittsburgh Police Department. The lead FAA investigator, a stern woman named Christine Reynolds, made her way directly to the cockpit where Jake was still sitting, now being checked over by a paramedic. "First Officer Morrison, I'm Inspector Reynolds, FAA. I need to ask you some questions about what happened up here." Jake nodded numbly, then remembered. "The kid. You need to talk to the kid. He's the one who will get to everyone," Reynolds assured him. "Right now, I need your account of events, from the beginning." As Jake began recounting the nightmare, Marcus found himself being ushered to the front of the plane by two other FAA officials. They were polite but firm, their questions coming rapid fire. "What's your name? How old are you? What were you doing in the cockpit? Where did you learn about aircraft systems?" Elena stayed beside him, her hand on his shoulder, both protective and grounding. Marcus answered each question carefully, truthfully, watching the investigator's skepticism gradually shift to astonishment. "You're telling me," one of them said slowly, "that you've never had formal flight training? Never been in a real cockpit before today?" "Not a real one," Marcus confirmed. "But the physics are the same. Lift, drag, thrust, weight, they don't care if it's real or simulated. The math works the same way." Vanessa Kirkland had been recording everything from her seat, her phone camera capturing the investigators, the aftermath, the whole chaotic scene. This wasn't just a story anymore, this was history. Her reporter instincts were screaming that she was sitting on something massive. She approached carefully, her phone still recording. "Excuse me, are you the young man who went into the cockpit?" Marcus looked at his mother, who shrugged helplessly. Everything was already so far beyond normal that a news interview seemed almost mundane by comparison. "Yeah," Marcus said simply. "I'm Vanessa Kirkland, News Channel 7. Would you be willing to talk about what happened?" "Just a few questions." Elena started to object, but Marcus spoke first. "Only if my mom says it's okay." Elena looked at her son, really looked at him. Not the suspended student who'd hacked the school's computers. Not the kid who spent too much time alone in his room with his laptop. But the young man who'd walked into a crisis and somehow, impossibly fixed it. "Okay," she said quietly. "But I'm staying right here." Vanessa's questions were sharp and professional. Marcus answered them with a calm clarity that seemed impossible for someone his age. Yes, he'd studied flight simulators. No, he'd never expected to use that knowledge in real life. Yes, he'd been terrified, but the fear had felt distant, academic, less important than the problem that needed solving. "Why did you stand up?" Vanessa asked. "Why not leave it to the professionals?" Marcus thought about that. "Because sometimes the professionals need help too. And because I knew something that could save lives. Not using that knowledge would have been wrong." The interview was interrupted by Inspector Reynolds, who needed Marcus for a formal deposition, as they led him toward the forward galley for a more private conversation. Other passengers began approaching Elena. "Your son is a hero," an elderly man said, his eyes wet with tears. "He saved my babies," a young mother added, her two small children clinging to her legs. Elena accepted their thanks with a dazed smile, barely processing the words. Her mind was still stuck on the image of Marcus walking into that cockpit, so calm, so certain. Where had that come from? How had she missed that her son had been quietly preparing for something like this? Outside, Captain Hayes was being loaded into the ambulance, Dr. Moss climbing in beside him. She'd already called ahead to UPMC Presbyterian, alerting their stroke team. Every minute counted now. The ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, racing toward the hospital 15 minutes away. Back in the cabin, Jake finally emerged from the cockpit, his legs unsteady. Another pilot from American Airlines, Captain Dennis Wright, who'd been deadheading in seat 8C, approached and grabbed Jake's shoulder. "Son, I've been flying for 32 years, Dennis said gruffly. "What you did today? Single engine landing with a medical emergency and a cabin full of panicked passengers? That's the kind of flying that defines a career. You should be proud." Jake managed a weak smile. "I had help. A lot of help. The best pilots always do," Dennis replied. "And they're smart enough to accept it." As the investigation continued, airport operations worked to deplane the passengers. Buses were brought to the aircraft to transport everyone to the terminal, where American Airlines had mobilized a small army of customer service agents to rebook flights, arrange hotels, and handle the logistical nightmare of 147 displaced travelers. Marcus caught sight of Jake being escorted off the plane by FAA officials and airline management. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the chaos. Jake mouthed 2 words. "Thank you," Marcus nodded. No other communication was needed. They'd been through something together that most people would never experience, never understand. They were bonded now by crisis and survival, by split-second decisions and impossible odds. As the buses pulled away from the aircraft, Marcus looked back at the 737 sitting on the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles and investigators. It looked smaller from out here, less imposing. Hard to believe that metal tube had been their entire world for the past hour. Elena squeezed his hand. "You know your suspension just got a lot more complicated, right?" Marcus laughed, a genuine surprised laugh that felt good after all the tension. "Yeah, I'm thinking they can't really punish me for hacking the cafeteria menu after this." "Don't bet on it," Elena said, but she was smiling too. Bureaucracy doesn't care about heroics. As they boarded the bus, neither of them noticed Vanessa Kirkland already on her phone, pitching the story to her producer. The kid who saved a plane. The maid's son who became a hero. This was national news. This was the kind of story that changed lives, and it was only just beginning. The Pittsburgh International Airport terminal buzzed with activity as news crews from every major network descended on the scene. Word had spread fast. A teenage boy with no formal training had helped land a crippled airliner. Within 2 hours, Marcus Chen's name was trending on social media. His story shared millions of times across platforms he didn't even use. Elena and Marcus sat in a private room American Airlines had provided, away from the chaos. Through the window they could see reporters setting up cameras, producers shouting into phones, the whole machinery of modern media spinning into overdrive. "Mom, this is getting crazy," Marcus said, scrolling through his phone. Someone had already found his old social media profiles, posting screenshots of his flight simulator posts, his coding projects, even a photo from 8th grade that made him cringe. Elena watched the circus outside with mounting anxiety. "Maybe we should just go home. Get out of here before—" A knock interrupted her. Inspector Reynolds entered, followed by a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as David Chen, no relation, Senior Vice President of American Airlines. "Marcus, Ms. Chen, I want to personally thank you both for what happened today," David said, his corporate polish barely concealing genuine emotion. What Marcus did was extraordinary, unprecedented, really. "We'd like to discuss how American Airlines might recognize his contribution." "He doesn't need recognition," Elena said quickly. "He just needs to get home." "Of course, and we've arranged first-class tickets to wherever you need to go. But there's more we'd like to offer." David pulled out a folder. "American Airlines would like to sponsor Marcus's education, full flight training, including commercial pilot certification once he's old enough. We'd also like to establish a scholarship in his name for other young people interested in aviation." Marcus's eyes widened. "You're serious?" "Completely. You demonstrated skills and composure that most veteran pilots would envy. We'd be honored to help you develop that talent properly." David paused. "There's also the matter of media interest. It's substantial. We can provide media training and support if you decide to do interviews, or we can help shield you from it if you prefer privacy. Your choice." Elena looked at her son, seeing the wonder and overwhelm playing across his face. "Can we think about it?" "Absolutely. Take all the time you need." David handed her a business card. "My personal cell is on there. Call any time." After he left, Inspector Reynolds took a seat across from them. "Marcus, I need to be straight with you about something. What you did saved lives, there's no question about that. But technically, you violated several FAA regulations by entering the cockpit during a critical phase of flight without authorization." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Am I in trouble? Reynolds smiled, the first genuine warmth they'd seen from her. Normally. Yes, very much so. But these aren't normal circumstances. The FAA has decided not to pursue any enforcement action. In fact, we're recommending you for a civilian aviation safety commendation. What you did demonstrated exactly the kind of problem-solving and quick thinking we want in pilots. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing. First Officer Morrison wanted me to tell you something. He said, the kid's got better instincts than half the pilots I've flown with. Tell him to get his license. Aviation needs people like him. After she left, Eleanor pulled Marcus into another hug. I'm so proud of you, and so terrified, and so confused about how my suspended teenager became a national hero in the span of 2 hours. Yeah, about that suspension, Marcus said sheepishly. Think Principal Hendricks will still care about the cafeteria thing? Elena laughed despite everything. Oh, he'll care, but maybe he'll care a little less. At UPMC Presbyterian Hospital, Captain Richard Hayes was out of emergency surgery. The neurosurgeons had successfully removed the clot causing his stroke, and while the prognosis was uncertain, Dr. Moss stood in the ICU waiting room and allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. Jake Morrison sat in that same waiting room, still in his uniform, unable to leave until he knew Hayes's fate. When the surgeon emerged with the update, Jake felt tears he'd been holding back for hours finally break through. He's stable, the surgeon reported. The next 72 hours are critical, but he's got a fighting chance. You got him here fast enough to make a difference. It wasn't just me, Jake said quietly. He'd spent the past 3 hours giving statements to investigators, and in every single one, he'd made sure they understood Marcus's role. The kid deserved credit. Hell, the kid deserved a medal. His phone buzzed with a text from his own father, a retired Navy pilot. Saw the news? You did the family proud, son. Single-engine emergency landing, that's no small thing. Jake smiled. Typing back, wait till you hear about the teenager who saved us all. Back at the airport, Vanessa Kirkland's initial footage had gone viral. Her interview with Marcus was being replayed on every news channel, his calm explanation of aerodynamics and flight physics captivating millions. Aviation experts were being brought on air to analyze what had happened, and every single one admitted the same thing. The kid knew his stuff, but not everyone was celebrating. On social media, the backlash had already begun. Critics questioned how a teenager could possibly have the knowledge to help land a plane. Conspiracy theorists suggested it was staged. Some accused the airline of negligence for allowing someone untrained into the cockpit. Marcus read some of the comments on his phone and felt the weight of public scrutiny for the first time. They're saying I couldn't have done it, he told his mother. That it's fake. Let them say whatever they want, Elena replied firmly. You know what happened. So does everyone on that plane. The rest is just noise. A text message popped up on Marcus's phone from an unknown number. This is Jake Morrison. Got your number from the airline. Just wanted to say thanks again. You've got a gift, kid. Don't waste it. Also, if you ever want a tour of a real cockpit the right way with permission, let me know. Marcus grinned, showing his mother the message. Elena read it and felt something shift in her chest. Her son had found something real, something meaningful. All those hours she'd worried about him alone in his room, isolated from the world. He'd been preparing, learning, growing into someone extraordinary. What do you want to do? She asked him. About all of this, the flight training, the interviews, everything? Marcus thought for a long moment, watching the sunset paint the Pittsburgh sky in shades of orange and gold. I want to be a pilot, a real one. I want to learn everything properly, not just from simulations. And I want to help other kids like me, the ones who don't fit in, who spend too much time on computers, who everyone thinks are wasting their lives. He looked at his mother. Maybe we weren't wasting anything. Maybe we were just getting ready for something nobody expected. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. When did you get so wise? Probably around the time I helped land a 737, Marcus said with a slight smile. That'll mature you real fast. 3 weeks later, Captain Richard Hayes woke up in his hospital bed to find half a dozen flower arrangements and a stack of get-well cards. His speech was slurred, his left side weak, but the doctors assured him that with therapy, he'd recover most of his function. Jake Morrison visited that afternoon, bringing with him a photo that had been taken in the cockpit just before the emergency. Hayes and Jake, both smiling, completely unaware that their routine flight was about to become international news. "Heard about the kid," Hayes managed to say, his words slow but clear. 16 years old. Saved us all. 17 now, actually, Jake corrected. Had a birthday last week. The airline threw him a party at their training facility. Gave him a simulator session with their best instructors. They said he flew better than some of their actual pilots. Hayes smiled, then grew serious. "I owe him my life. We all do. He's coming by tomorrow if you're up for visitors. Wants to meet the captain whose plane he helped land." "I'd like that," Hayes said. "I'd like that very much." Back in Dallas, Lincoln High School held a special assembly. Principal Hendricks stood at the podium, looking decidedly uncomfortable as he addressed the student body. "While Marcus Chen's recent actions were undeniably heroic, we want to remind everyone that this does not excuse the violation of school policy that led to his suspension. However," he cleared his throat, "in recognition of his extraordinary service and the positive attention he's brought to our school, we're reducing his suspension to time served and welcoming him back to campus." The auditorium erupted in cheers. Marcus sat in the front row, his mother beside him, trying not to blush as his classmates, many of whom had never spoken to him before, chanted his name. After the assembly, students crowded around him asking for selfies, autographs, wanting to hear the story firsthand. It was overwhelming and surreal, but Marcus noticed something else too. The coding club had tripled in size overnight. Kids who'd never touched a computer were suddenly interested in flight simulators, in aviation, in the intersection of technology and real-world problem-solving. He'd accidentally become an inspiration. That responsibility felt heavier than anything he'd done in the cockpit. 6 months later, on a clear spring morning, Marcus stood in front of a small Cessna 172 at a local flight school. Beside him was his instructor, a retired Air Force pilot who'd volunteered his time after hearing Marcus's story. "Ready for your first real flying lesson?" the instructor asked. Marcus ran his hand along the Cessna's wing, feeling the smooth metal, the solid reality of it. No simulation, no computer screen. Just him, the plane, and the sky. "Ready," he said. As they climbed into the cockpit, Marcus's phone buzzed one last time. A message from Captain Hayes, who was back home in Colorado, recovering well, planning his return to flying. "Remember, kid, the sky's not the limit. It's just the beginning." Marcus smiled, powered off his phone, and reached for the controls. The engine roared to life, propeller spinning, the whole aircraft vibrating with potential energy. His instructor's voice came through the headset. "Okay, Marcus, take us up," and he did. The plane lifted off the runway smoothly, climbing into the Texas sky, leaving the ground behind. Marcus felt the same calm certainty he'd experienced that day at 35,000 feet. The knowledge that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Below him, the world spread out in miniature. Roads and buildings, rivers and fields, all the complexity of human life reduced to patterns and shapes. Up here, things made sense. Up here, the math worked. Up here, a kid who didn't quite fit anywhere else could find his place. Elena watched from the ground, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun, the other pressed to her chest. Her son was flying. Really flying. And somehow, impossibly, that made perfect sense, because heroes don't always look like we expect them to. Sometimes they're awkward teenagers in hoodies. Sometimes they're the kids sitting alone in the back of the plane, the ones nobody notices, the ones who spend their time learning things nobody asked them to learn. Sometimes heroes are just ordinary people who, when the moment comes, stand up and do the extraordinary thing. And sometimes, when the pilot passes out mid-flight and everyone screams in terror, those heroes are exactly the ones we need up next. You've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.